The wind across the high plains of Arizona has a voice. Most days it whispers secrets of dust and bone. But on that particular afternoon, in the winter of '88, it screamed. It screamed a prophecy of ice and death, clawing at the lonely ranch house of Caleb McGregor. For 10 years, since the day he'd buried his wife Martha, that wind had been Caleb's only constant companion. He was a man hollowed out by grief, living in a shell of memories. But as the sky turned the color of a deep bruise, he saw them. Not ghosts, not memories, but 9 towering silhouettes on horseback emerging from the swirling snow. They were Apache, and they were riding straight for his door. Caleb McGregor was a man tethered to the past. His world had shrunk to the 640 acres of the Morning Dove Ranch, a spread of land named by his wife for the birds that cooed from the cottonwoods each dawn. Now the cooing sounded like a lament. At 45, his face was a road map of hardship carved by sun and sorrow. His hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was streaked with the gray of ash, and his eyes, a piercing blue, held a permanent storm that rivaled the one now gathering in the west. 10 years, a decade since the Comanche raid. Not here, not at the ranch, that was the bitter irony. They had been in the town of Redemption, picking up supplies. Martha had been admiring a bolt of calico fabric at Abernathy's Mercantile when the whoops and gunfire erupted. It was a rogue band, drunk on whiskey and rage. Caleb, a former army scout, had grabbed his rifle, but in the chaos, a stray arrow. He never finished the thought. He couldn't. The memory was a shard of glass in his heart. To press on it was to bleed. He buried her on the rise, overlooking the ranch, beneath a solitary juniper tree. From that day forward, the world outside his fences ceased to matter. He worked from can't-see morn to can't-see night. He mended fences, branded his small herd of Hereford cattle, and spoke only to his horse, a stoic buckskin named Pilgrim. The silence of his clapboard house was absolute, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the hiss of the fire. Every object was a shrine. Martha's rocking chair sat by the hearth, a half-finished piece of knitting still in its basket. Her initials, MM, were carved into the mantelpiece, her final touch on the home they'd built together. Caleb was a ghost in his own life, haunting the rooms where laughter once lived. The people in Redemption, a 2-hour ride away, had long since given up on him. Sheriff Brody might send his well-meaning but callow deputy, a young man named Miller, out once or twice a year to check if Caleb was still breathing. Caleb would accept the offered coffee answer in monosyllables and wait for the deputy to ride away, leaving him to his preferred solitude. His grief was a high wall, and he had no intention of letting anyone climb it. Especially not an Indian. Any Indian. In his mind, twisted by pain, the Comanche who took Martha had tainted them all. He saw them not as tribes, Chiricahua, Mescalero Comanche, but as a single monolithic threat that had stolen his son and left him in perpetual twilight. That afternoon, the sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue. But by 3 o'clock, a greasy, dark line appeared on the northwestern horizon, expanding with unnatural speed. Caleb, reading the signs like a chapter in a familiar book, knew it was no ordinary squall. This was a blue norther, a monster of a storm that could drop temperatures by 50 degrees in an hour and bury the world in a tomb of snow. He'd spent the last 2 hours securing his livestock in the sturdy barn he and Martha had raised with their own hands. The cattle were huddled, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Pilgrim was safe in his stall. As he fought his way from the barn back to the house, The wind was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his skin like needles. The world had vanished, replaced by a screaming white void. He slammed the door shut, the sound swallowed by the gale, and leaned against it, his chest heaving. He was safe. Alone, but safe. He stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the empty room feel even larger. He set a pot of coffee to boil the familiar aroma, a small comfort. He was settling into his worn armchair, the Winchester rifle he always kept loaded resting against the wall beside him, when a sound cut through the storm's howl. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, resonant call, a man's voice. Caleb froze, every muscle tensing. He grabbed the Winchester, the cold steel, a familiar weight in his hands. He moved silently to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted pane. Through the maelstrom of snow, he saw them. They were phantoms materialized from the blizzard. 9 riders, their horses' exhausted heads low against the wind. The men were huge, broad-shouldered, wrapped in thick buffalo robes and blankets, their long black hair whipped by the gale. Even from a distance through the obscuring snow, he could see the proud, unyielding set of their jaws. They were Apache, and their leader, a man who sat his horse like a king on a throne, was raising a hand not in aggression, but in a sign of parley. A cold, hard knot of hatred and fear tightened in Caleb's gut. It was the same visceral reaction he'd had for 10 years. His thumb moved instinctively to cock the hammer of the Winchester. It would be so easy. A warning shot. Send them back into the storm that spawned them. Let the blizzard finish them. It would be justice. But as the lead rider dismounted, his movements stiff with cold, and began to walk toward the porch, Caleb saw something that stopped him. The man didn't carry a rifle in his hands. His posture wasn't that of a warrior seeking a fight, but of a man at the end of his rope seeking deliverance. Behind him, on one of the other horses, a smaller bundle was visible, huddled between 2 warriors. The Apache leader stopped 20 feet from the porch, a respectful distance. He stood straight, letting the wind tear at him, a figure of impossible endurance. He was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of chiseled granite, his eyes dark and piercing even in the gloom. "We seek shelter," the man's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. "The storm is a demon. It will kill our horses, our people." Caleb remained in the shadows of the room, his rifle held tight. The word people registered. He glanced back at the small bundle on the horse. A child. His mind warred with itself. The raw, screaming wound of Martha's death bled fresh hatred. Let them freeze. They are killers, murderers. But another voice, a deeper, older part of him. The man Martha had loved, the man who believed in the unwritten codes of the frontier, spoke as well. "You don't leave a dog to die in a storm like this." The Apache leader waited patient as stone. He had made his appeal. The next move was Caleb's. Caleb watched as one of the horses finally succumbed, its legs buckling. It fell into the snow with a soft thud, too exhausted to even cry out. The warrior riding it dismounted and stood over it, placing a hand on its neck in a final grim farewell. They were desperate. Truly desperate. His finger eased off the trigger. The hatred was still there, a venomous coil in his belly, but it was being challenged by a grudging humanity he thought he'd long since buried. He thought of Martha. What would she have done? He knew the answer instantly. She would have thrown the door open, her heart incapable of refusing shelter to any soul in need, man or beast. Cursing himself, cursing the world, cursing the storm for bringing this impossible choice to his door. Caleb McGregor unbolted the lock. The heavy oak door swung inward with a groan. He stood, framed in the doorway, the warm light of the cabin spilling out behind him, the Winchester held loosely at his side, not aimed but ready. "Your weapons." Caleb's voice was a rusty rasp. "Leave them on the porch. The barn has room for your horses. You can take shelter there." The Apache leader's eyes met his across the swirling snow. There was no gratitude in them, not yet. Only a flicker of grim acknowledgement. "The barn is for animals. We have a child with us. He will not survive in a barn." Caleb's gaze hardened. "That's my offer. Take it or ride on." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Two solitary figures locked in a battle of wills while the world raged around them. Then the Apache leader gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his men and spoke in their tongue, his words sharp and commanding. One by one, the 8 other men dismounted. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their exhaustion plain to see. They carefully unstrapped their rifles and cartridge belts, laying them in a neat pile on the edge of the porch as instructed. The 2 warriors who had flanked the small bundle gently lifted it down. It was a boy no older than 9 or 10, wrapped tightly in furs. His face was pale with cold, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. When the last weapon was laid down, the leader turned back to Caleb. "It is done." Caleb's jaw was a block of granite. He despised himself for what he was about to do, yet he knew he had no other choice. He stepped back from the door. "Bring the boy inside. The rest of you to the barn. I'll bring you blankets and what food I can spare." The leader looked from the boy to the barn, then back to Caleb's unyielding face. He seemed to understand. He was being tested. "My name is Chiricahua," he said, his voice low and formal. "This boy is Nantan. He is precious to our people. I will stay with him." "One of you." Caleb conceded, his voice tight. "The rest go to the barn. Now, before you all freeze where you stand." Without another word, 7 of the giant Apaches turned and began the arduous task of leading their weary mounts toward the dark outline of the barn. Chiricahua, the leader, lifted the small boy into his arms as if he weighed nothing and walked onto the porch, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. Caleb McGregor stepped aside and allowed the Apache chief and the boy to cross the threshold into his home. As he closed the door, shutting out the screaming wind, an even more terrifying storm began to rage inside the 4 walls of the cabin and within the desolate landscape of his own heart. The silence he had cultivated for a decade had been shattered. The air inside the small cabin was instantly thick with a tension that could be cut with a knife. Caleb felt like a stranger in his own home. The space once filled only with his ghosts was now occupied by 2 living, breathing symbols of everything he had grown to hate. Chiricahua stood by the door, a towering, silent presence, holding the boy Nantan, who shivered uncontrollably despite the heavy furs. "Set him by the fire," Caleb said. His voice clipped. He didn't offer to help. Chiricahua moved with a fluid grace that belied his size. He gently knelt and unwrapped the boy from his cocoon of blankets. Nantan was thin, with sharp, intelligent features and eyes that held the ancient gravity of his people. He looked at Caleb not with the simple fear of a child, but with the watchful assessment of a young warrior. Chiricahua began rubbing the boy's hands and feet, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Caleb turned away, busying himself at the stove. He poured 3 mugs of the strong black coffee, the mundane action a frail defense against the turmoil inside him. He placed 1 mug on the floor near Chiricahua, without a word, then retreated to his side of the room, sipping his own. He watched them over the rim of his cup, his hand never straying far from the Winchester. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless howl of the wind outside. Chiricahua spoke softly to the boy in the Apache language, his tone reassuring. Nantan eventually stopped shivering, the warmth of the hearth seeping into his small body. He drank some of the coffee his guardian offered him, grimacing at the bitterness but obeying. Caleb broke the silence. "The rest of your men, they'll need food. They are warriors. They can endure," Chiricahua replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Even warriors get hungry." Caleb grunted. He went to his pantry, a small nook stocked with the staples of a solitary life, sacks of flour and beans, smoked bacon, canned peaches and jerky. He packed a sack with a slab of bacon, a bag of hardtack biscuits, and several strips of venison jerky. He also grabbed a stack of old coarse wool blankets from a storage chest. "I'll be back," he said, pulling on his heavy coat and hat. He picked up his lantern, leaving the Winchester behind with a flicker of hesitation. Stealing a rifle was one thing. Facing this storm to get to the barn was another. He trusted the blizzard more than he trusted his guests. The journey to the barn was a brutal battle against the elements. The snow was already knee-deep and drifting higher against the buildings. The wind was a solid wall he had to push through. Inside the barn, the 7 Apaches had already tended to their horses, rubbing them down with dry sacks and covering them with their own saddle blankets. They had found a corner out of the draft and sat huddled together, stoic and silent, their faces grim. They looked up as Caleb entered their dark eyes, following his every move. There was no hostility, only a deep, primal weariness. Caleb set down the sack of food and the blankets. "It's not much," he said to the man who seemed to be the second in command, a warrior with a jagged scar across one cheek. "But it's hot in the cabin. The boy is safe." The scarred warrior simply nodded his eyes, conveying a message Caleb couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't gratitude, but perhaps a grudging respect for a promise kept. Without a word, the men divided the food, each taking a share and eating slowly, methodically. When Caleb returned to the cabin, shaking the snow from his coat, he saw that something had shifted. Chiricahua was no longer kneeling by the fire. He was standing by the mantelpiece, looking at the small hand-carved wooden dove that sat there. It was crudely carved, but with love. It was the last thing Martha had made. "Morning Dove Ranch." Chiricahua said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at Caleb, but at the carving. "A sad name for a strong place. My wife named it." Caleb set his throat tight. "She liked the birds." Chiricahua turned to face him fully. His gaze was direct, unsettling. "A man does not live in a place of sadness unless he has a great sorrow in his heart." Caleb's temper flared. "My heart is my own business." "Perhaps," Chiricahua said, his expression unreadable. "But when you invite the storm into your house, your business becomes the storm's business." He gestured around the room. "This place is a shrine, not a home. You do not live here. You wait here." "Wait for what?" Caleb shot back, his hand clenching into a fist. "To die," Chiricahua said simply without malice. "You wait to join the one who carved this bird." The truth of the words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. He had never admitted it, not even to himself, but the Apache chief had seen through him in less than an hour, had seen the hollow core of his existence. all the anger drained out of him, replaced by a vast, familiar emptiness. He slumped into his chair, the fight gone out of him. Nantan had fallen asleep on the hearth rug, his face peaceful in the firelight. Chirikawa moved from the mantel and sat cross-legged on the floor, a respectful distance from Caleb. "We are not raiding," he said, his voice softer now. "We are not looking for a fight. We are taking the boy to safety, to the Dragoon Mountains. He is the son of our great chief who has passed to the spirit world. Nantan is our future. There are white men who do not want him to have a future." Caleb listened, saying nothing. "A man, an Indian agent named Blevins, has put a price on the boy's head. A secret price, but a rich one. He wants our land, the land promised to us by treaty. With Nantan gone, he believes our people will scatter, that our spirit will break." A corrupt agent, a land grab. It was a story as old as the frontier itself. It was dirty ugly, and had the ring of truth. "He hired a man to hunt us," Chirikawa continued. "A bounty hunter. A man with no soul known as Rourke. Phineas Rourke. He and his dogs have been on our trail for a week. We thought we had lost them in the foothills. But this storm, it was a trap for us all." The name Rourke sent a chill down Caleb's spine. He'd heard of him. A ruthless ex-Confederate who led a gang of cutthroats known for taking scalps, white or Indian, if the price was right. They were vultures who followed the scent of death and money. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the night. A frantic pounding on the door. It wasn't the measured knock of a traveler. It was urgent, desperate. Caleb grabbed the Winchester, his heart hammering. Chirikawa was on his feet in an instant, moving Nantan into the darkest corner of the room and shielding him with his body. "Who is it?" Caleb called out. "It's me, Mr. McGregor, Deputy Miller." The voice was thin and panicked. "Sheriff Brody sent me. I saw your light. My horse gave out a mile back. Please, for the love of God, let me in." Caleb hesitated, glancing at Chirikawa. The chief's face was a stone mask. Caleb knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave the boy to die in the snow. He unlocked the door. Deputy Miller stumbled in, covered in snow, his face blue with cold. He was a young man, barely 20, with a flimsy moustache and frightened eyes. He collapsed on the floor, gasping. "The storm. It's a killer," he wheezed. Then his eyes widened as they adjusted to the light. He saw Chirikawa. He saw the sleeping boy. His gaze darted around the room, taking in the extra coffee mug, the palpable tension. The fear in his eyes was replaced by something else, a greedy, calculating glint. "Well, I'll be—" Miller breathed a slow, ugly smile spreading across his half-frozen face. "Looks like I found more than just a warm fire." He looked at Chirikawa, then at Caleb. "You harboring wanted fugitives, McGregor. There's a big reward out for a certain Apache boy." The word reward hung in the air like poison. Chirikawa's hand subtly moved to the hilt of the long knife tucked in his belt. Caleb's blood ran cold. The deputy hadn't been sent by the sheriff. He hadn't stumbled here by accident. He was part of it. He was one of Rourke's dogs, sent ahead to scout. "There's no reward here, Miller," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. He raised the Winchester, the barrel now pointed squarely at the deputy's chest. "Only a lost man I took in from the storm, the same as I did for you. Now you can sit quiet by that fire until the storm passes, or you can be buried under it." Miller's smile faltered. He looked from Caleb's icy blue eyes to the muzzle of the rifle, and the bravado drained from his face. "Now hold on, McGregor. No need for that. We can all be reasonable." "I stopped being reasonable 10 years ago," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Get up, slowly, and move to that chair in the corner." As Miller shakily complied, Chiricahwa's deep voice cut through the tension. He was looking at Caleb, but his words were for the deputy. "You follow Phineas Rourke." It was a statement, not a question. Miller paled. "I don't know who you're talking about." "You reek of his greed," Chiricahwa said with contempt. "Tell me, where is he?" "I ain't tellin' you nothin', you savage." Miller spat his fear, giving way to bluster. Caleb stepped forward and pressed the rifle barrel under Miller's chin, forcing his head back. "The man he's with killed my wife." Caleb lied the words, tasting like ash. He didn't know if Rourke had anything to do with the Comanches, but it didn't matter. In that moment, he needed the lie. "So you can talk to him." He nodded towards Chiricahwa. "Or you can talk to me. Either way, you're going to talk." The fight went out of Deputy Miller completely. He started to tremble. "They're holed up in redemption," he stammered. "At the saloon, Rourke and his men, a dozen of them. They were waiting for the storm to break before coming after you. But when I didn't return, they'll come. They'll follow my tracks as soon as they can." The cabin, once a shelter from the storm, had just become a trap. The blizzard wasn't their enemy anymore. It was their only shield, and it wouldn't last forever. Chiricahwa looked at Caleb, his expression grim. "He is right. When the snow stops, they will come." He then walked back to the mantelpiece and picked up the small wooden dove. He turned it over in his large hands. "I saw the ones who did this to you," he said softly, his gaze meeting Caleb's. The sudden shift in topic was jarring. 10 winters ago, in the valley of the San Pedro, a band of Comanche, their faces painted for war. They raided the town. Caleb stared at him, speechless. "My warriors and I were hunting." Chiricahwa continued, his voice heavy with memory. "We came upon the town after. We saw the dead. We saw a woman with hair like the sun lying near the mercantile, an arrow in her heart." Caleb felt the floor drop out from under him. He was looking at a man who had witnessed the scene of his life's greatest tragedy. "That Comanche band," Chiricahwa said, his voice hardening. "They were renegades, mad dogs, enemies of my people, the Chiricahwa Apache. We hunted them for 2 moons after that. We are not them, Caleb McGregor. Your sorrow is with the Comanche, not the Apache." He placed the wooden dove gently back on the mantel. For the first time in a decade, the monolithic wall of Caleb's hatred began to crack. He had painted all tribes with the same brush, fueled by his all-consuming grief. Now the man he saw as his enemy was telling him they had a shared foe. The world, which had been so starkly black and white, was suddenly awash in shades of grey. He looked at Chiricahwa, at the sleeping boy, Nantan, at the traitorous deputy trembling in the corner. The storm outside was still raging, but the true battle was no longer against the ghosts of the past. It was against the flesh and blood monsters who would be coming with the dawn. And in that battle, the widowed rancher and the Apache chief were no longer host and guest. They were allies. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Chiricahwa had not just named Caleb's pain, he had separated it from the men in his house, drawing a line in the sand of history that Caleb could not ignore. The hatred he had nursed for a decade, a thick tar-like substance that coated his soul, began to dissolve, leaving behind the raw, clean wound of grief. He was still a man defined by loss, but for the first time, he saw a path beyond it. A bloody, dangerous path lay immediately ahead, but a path nonetheless. Rourke will not wait for the storm to die completely. Caleb said, his voice finding a new tone, not the rasp of a recluse, but the firm command of the army scout he once was. He's impatient. He'll use the cover of the last squalls to approach. Chiricahua nodded in agreement. He will think you are one old man alone. He will be arrogant. He's right about one thing. Caleb looked at Deputy Miller with disgust. He'll follow this one's tracks. They'll lead him right to the front door. Then we will not welcome him at the front door, Chiricahua stated. A silent understanding passed between them. The time for talk was over. The time for preparation had begun. Keep him quiet, Caleb ordered, gesturing with the rifle at Miller. He went to the door and peered out. The wind was still fierce, but the snowfall was becoming finer, less of a blinding sheet. They had hours, perhaps, not days. He turned back inside. The main house is a kill box. Too many windows. The barn is better. Stone foundation, thick walls, fewer approaches. My warriors are there, Chiricahua said. It is our best fortress. Get the boy to the barn, Caleb instructed. I'll deal with him. He jerked his chin at Miller, who was now sweating despite the cabin's chill. We need to move. Now! Chiricahua gently woke Nantan, speaking to him in low, calm tones. The boy showed no fear, only a solemn understanding as he was bundled once more into his furs. While Chiricahua prepared the boy, Caleb turned his attention to the deputy. On your feet, Miller. Miller stumbled upwards. McGregor, listen, I can help you. I can ride out. Tell Rourke you overpowered me, that the Apaches are long gone. You're a poor liar, Miller, Caleb said coldly, and Rourke is no fool. He'd kill you for your failure. He grabbed a length of rope from a peg on the wall. You're going to be our insurance. Quickly and efficiently, he bound the deputy's hands behind his back and gagged him with a strip of cloth torn from a flour sack. Miller's eyes were wide with terror. Caleb shoved him towards the cabin's small, dark root cellar. You can wait for your friends in here. He pushed the deputy down the short flight of stairs and slammed the heavy door, dropping the thick wooden bar across it. By the time he turned back, Chiricahua was ready. Nantan held securely against his chest. Caleb grabbed his Winchester, an extra box of 44-40 cartridges, and his Colt Peacemaker from its peg buckling the gun belt around his waist. The feel of it was as natural as breathing. Let's go, he said. The journey to the barn was a mad dash through the swirling twilight of the storm. The wind tore at them, trying to pull them apart, but they moved as one unit, Caleb leading the way, Chiricahua and the boy right behind him. They burst into the relative quiet of the barn. The 7 Apache warriors were instantly on their feet, knives and tomahawks appearing in their hands. They relaxed only when they saw Chiricahua. The chief spoke rapidly in his own tongue, explaining the situation. As he spoke, the warriors' faces hardened. They were no longer weary refugees. They were hunters, their eyes gleaming with a cold fire in the lantern light. The scarred warrior whose name Caleb learned was Baishon. The crow looked at Caleb, then gave a curt, sharp nod. The alliance was sealed. They will come from the east following the tracks from town, Caleb said, taking command of the situation. His old instincts as a scout took over completely. The creek bed will give them cover to within 200 yards of the house. They'll assume we're inside. He looked around the barn. This is our strong point. They'll have to cross open ground to get to us. The barn was a fortress in the making. A stone foundation rose 4 feet high, topped by thick timber walls. A large hayloft offered a commanding view. "Baishan," Chirikawa commanded. "You have the eyes of your namesake. To the loft. Watch the house. Watch the creek." The scarred warrior nodded and flowed up the ladder to the hayloft, disappearing into the shadows above. "We need to make them think we're still in the house," Caleb said. He looked at the youngest of the warriors, a man barely older than Deputy Miller, but with a lifetime more steel in his eyes. You're fast," the young warrior nodded. "I need you to get back to the house. There's a lantern on the table. Keep it lit, but stay low away from the windows. When the shooting starts, you get back here. Understand?" Chirikawa translated. The young warrior Dasan gave Caleb a look of fierce pride and slipped out of the barn, a ghost in the snow. The next hour was spent in tense, focused preparation. Under Caleb's direction, the Apaches helped him move heavy feed sacks and old farm equipment, creating fortified positions inside the barn doors and at the few windows. They would have clear fields of fire while remaining in deep shadow. Chirikawa posted his men with tactical brilliance, 2 at the main doors, 2 at the rear entrance, and 2 as a mobile reserve, ready to counter any breach. Caleb took his position near the main door, resting his Winchester on a feed sack. He laid out his extra cartridges where he could reach them easily. Beside him, an Apache warrior with intricate beadwork on his moccasins checked the edge of his tomahawk with his thumb. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were soldiers, preparing for a siege. Nantan was hidden deep within the barn, in a small, secure tack room, shielded by hay bales. Chirikawa had spoken to him quietly, and the boy had nodded, his face betraying no fear, only a solemn resolve. He was the son of a chief, and he would act like it. As the last of the light bled from the sky, the wind began to subside. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than the howl had been. Every creak of the barn, every nervous snort from the horses sounded like a gunshot. Then from the hayloft, Baishan made a soft noise, the low call of a raven. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. "What is it?" he whispered up to the shadows. "Men." Baishan's voice was a low rasp. 10. No, 12 of them. On foot. Moving along the creek. Rourke is with them. A big man in a long coat. Caleb sighted down the barrel of his rifle, pointing it towards the empty snow-covered expanse between the barn and the house. "They're making for the house, just like we thought." The minutes stretched into an eternity. The group of dark figures emerged from the creek bed, moving in a low crouch through the snow. They surrounded the small cabin, the single-lit lantern inside a beacon, drawing them to their doom. Caleb could make out the shapes of men positioning themselves at the windows, rifles ready. He saw the large figure of Phineas Rourke motion his men forward. "Let them commit," Caleb whispered, as much to himself as to the Apache beside him. "Let them get hungry." Rourke kicked open the cabin door, and 2 of his men rushed inside. There was a moment of silence, then angry, confused shouts. They had found the house empty. Rourke strode out onto the porch, his face a mask of fury, in the faint light spilling from the doorway. "McGregor!" he roared, his voice booming across the snow. "You coward, hiding with savages. I know you're out here. I have a 12 rifles and a deputy sheriff as a witness to your treason. Come on out, and I might let you live." Silence was his only answer. "Fine," Rourke bellowed. Burn it all." One of his men ran back in it. Moments later, A flicker of orange appeared in a window, then another. They were setting the house on fire. Caleb felt a pang in his chest. The rocking chair, the mantelpiece with Martha's initials, 10 years of memory going up in smoke. He hardened his heart. They were just things. He was alive. He had a battle to win. As the flames began to lick up the walls of the cabin, casting a hellish, dancing light across the snow, the bounty hunters grew bold, thinking they had flushed their quarry. They stood silhouetted against the fire, laughing and shouting. It was the mistake Caleb and Chiricahua had been waiting for. "Now." Chiricahua's voice was deadly calm. From the hayloft, Baishan's rifle cracked the sound sharp and final. One of the men standing by the fire spun around and fell face first into the snow. Before the others could react, Caleb's Winchester roared, and another man, clutching his chest, staggered back into the wall of the burning cabin. The night erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from the barn, a disciplined, targeted volley. 2 more of Rourke's men went down. The bounty hunters, caught completely by surprise and brilliantly illuminated by the fire, scrambled for cover, firing wildly into the darkness. Their shots splintered the barn walls high above the defenders' heads. Dasan, the young warrior, sprinted from the back of the burning house, a moving shadow against the flames, and dove head first through the side door of the barn safe. "They're breaking for the creek," Baishan yelled from the loft. "Do not let them reach it," Chiricahua commanded. The Apaches fired with deadly accuracy, their rifles speaking in a steady rhythm. Caleb worked the lever of his Winchester, firing, ejecting, chambering, firing again. He was no longer a grieving rancher. He was a soldier. Rourke, a survivor of 100 such fights, had managed to dive behind the stone well in the yard. "To the barn!" he screamed at his remaining men. "They're in the barn. Flank them, get to the back." 3 of his men broke from cover and made a desperate run for the rear of the barn. But Chiricahua had anticipated this. He and the 2 reserve warriors were waiting. The night was filled with the screams of the attackers as they were met with a storm of lead from the back door. The fight devolved into a brutal siege. Rourke and his few remaining men were pinned down, using the well and the bodies of their own fallen comrades for cover. They returned fire, but it was sporadic and panicked. The defenders in the barn were disciplined, firing only at clear targets. An hour passed. The cabin was now a roaring inferno, casting the entire ranch in its ghastly light. Rourke knew he was losing. In a desperate gambit, he yelled, "McGregor, I know about the boy. That's a $5,000 bounty. We can split it. Just give up the Apache." Caleb sighted down his rifle barrel at the stone well. "I'm not interested in your money, Rourke," he yelled back. "Then you'll die a traitor!" Rourke screamed and fired a wild shot that ricocheted off the stone above Caleb's head. Suddenly, a new sound, the thud of an axe against wood. "The back wall," Baishan shouted from the loft. "One of them is at the back wall." Chiricahua and another warrior disappeared into the darkness at the rear of the barn. There was the sound of splintering wood, a choked cry, and then silence. Chiricahua returned his tomahawk, dripping. "The wall is secure." But the distraction had cost them. In that moment, Rourke and his last 2 men made a final desperate charge, running straight for the main doors of the barn, firing as they came. Caleb shot one of them down 20 feet from the door. The other one, however, managed to dive through the entrance, a pistol blazing in his hand. The Apache warrior next to Caleb grunted and fell back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Before the bounty hunter could fire again, Caleb swung the heavy stock of his Winchester, cracking the man across the skull and sending him to the floor. Now it was just Rourke. The big man was a berserker, charging forward, firing his heavy dragoon revolver. Caleb felt a searing pain in his left shoulder as a bullet tore through it, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle, his arm suddenly useless. Rourke loomed in the doorway, a giant silhouette against the fire, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He leveled his revolver at Caleb's head, but he had forgotten about the chief. From the shadows, Chiricahua launched himself forward. He moved not like a man, but like a force of nature, a mountain in motion. He slammed into Rourke, and the two massive men crashed to the floor. It was a primal, brutal struggle. No guns, just fists and knives and teeth. Rourke was strong, but Chiricahua was fury incarnate. He was fighting for the future of his people, embodied in the small boy hidden in the back. Caleb, gritting his teeth against the blinding pain in his shoulder, fumbled for his Colt peacemaker with his right hand. He couldn't get a clear shot. The two men were a blur of motion. Rourke managed to get his knife free and slashed upwards, catching Chiricahua on the arm. The chief grunted in pain but did not relent. He drove his head into Rourke's face, rewarded with the crunch of breaking bone. Rourke screamed and recoiled, giving Caleb the opening he needed. He fired the Colt. The shot was deafening inside the barn. Phineas Rourke stiffened a look of utter surprise on his bloody face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, then up at Caleb, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. He collapsed sideways, the fight, the greed, the life gone from him forever. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the roar of the burning cabin and the pained gasps of the wounded warrior. The siege was over. In the flickering, hellish light of his own burning past, Caleb McGregor slumped against a support beam, pressing his right hand against the searing wound in his left shoulder. The adrenaline that had sustained him drained away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion and waves of excruciating pain. The battle was over, but the cost was only just beginning to be counted. Chiricahua rose, breathing heavily, his arm bleeding freely from Rourke's knife wound. He ignored his own injury and immediately went to the warrior who had been shot during the final charge. He knelt beside him, speaking soft words in their native tongue. The warrior, whose name was Taza, looked up at his chief. His eyes clouded with pain, but filled with pride. He tried to speak, coughed, and then his eyes went vacant. Chiricahua gently closed them and bowed his head, for a moment, a silent, powerful tribute to a fallen comrade. The cost: one Apache warrior dead, Caleb wounded. His home, a pyre of memories, was collapsing into a mound of glowing embers. Bai Shan climbed down from the loft, his face grim. He and the other surviving warriors moved through the aftermath with a grim efficiency. They checked the bodies of Rourke's men, ensuring none were feigning death. They collected the bounty hunters' weapons, adding them to their own depleted arsenal. There was no celebration, no cries of victory. There was only the solemn work of survival. Chiricahua approached Caleb, tearing a strip of cloth from his own shirt. "You fought well, rancher," he said, his voice a low rumble. He expertly, if not gently, bound Caleb's shoulder, creating a tight pressure bandage to staunch the bleeding. The pain made Caleb's vision swim, but he gritted his teeth and bore it. "Your man?" Caleb began, nodding towards the fallen warrior. "He was Taza, a good man, a brave warrior." Chiricahua said, his voice flat, masking a deep well of sorrow. "He died, protecting our future. There is no better death." He looked at the smoldering ruins of the cabin. "You have lost much tonight." Caleb stared at the fire. The rocking chair was gone. The mantelpiece was gone. The carved dove was gone. Everything that had tied him to his grief, every physical object he had used as an anchor to his misery, had been burned away. He had expected to feel a profound sense of loss. Instead, strangely, he felt light. The heavy chains of the past had not been unlocked. They had been melted away in the crucible of the firefight. "It was just a house," Caleb said, surprising himself with the words. "It wasn't a home. Not for a long time." As dawn approached, it brought with it the end of the blizzard. The sky cleared to a bruised purple, then a pale, cold grey. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of snow, marred only by the black scar of the burned-out cabin and the dark shapes of the dead. The Apaches prepared to leave. They had to keep moving. Rourke may have been the head of the snake, but there was still a corrupt agent and a world of danger ahead of them. They retrieved Deputy Miller from the root cellar. The man was incoherent with terror. "What do we do with him?" Bai Shan asked Chiricahua, his hand resting on his knife. Caleb looked at the trembling deputy. There was a time he would have left him for the buzzards. But the man he was 12 hours ago was not the man he was now. "Tie him to his horse and send him back to redemption." Caleb said, his voice strained. "Let him tell Sheriff Brody what happens when you side with monsters like Rourke. Let the fear do its work." Chiricahua considered this, then nodded. "It is a wise judgment. Fear can be a better weapon than a bullet." They loaded Taza's body onto a horse for a proper burial in their own sacred ground. As the surviving 7 warriors mounted their horses, Chiricahua came to stand before Caleb one last time. Nantan, safe and unharmed, stood beside him, his large, dark eyes fixed on the wounded rancher. "We owe you a debt that cannot be repaid with horses or weapons," Chiricahua said. "There is no debt," Caleb replied, leaning against the barn for support. "You told me the truth about the Comanches. You took a piece of a burden I've carried for 10 years. For that, I am in your debt." Chiricahua untucked the long knife from his belt. It was a beautiful weapon, the handle wrapped in sinew and beadwork, the blade sharp and clean. He held it out to Caleb. "No, we are now brothers, you and I, forged in fire and blood. You will not be forgotten by the Chiricahua people." Caleb hesitated, then took the knife with his good hand. In return, he fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out his own small whittling knife and a piece of scrap wood he always carried. He quickly, despite his pain, carved a crude but recognizable shape of a horse. He handed it to Nantan. "For your journey," Caleb said to the boy, "may your path be swift and sure." Nantan took the small carving, his fingers closing around it tightly. He looked up at Caleb, and for the first time the boy's solemn expression broke into a small, fleeting smile. It was a sunrise in the midst of the devastation. With a final deep nod of respect, Chiricahua swung onto his horse. "Vaya con Dios, Caleb McGregor," he said, using the Spanish phrase common to the borderlands. "You too, Chiricahua," Caleb replied. "You too." He watched as the 9 horses, 8 riders, and 1 carrying their fallen brother rode west, disappearing into the vast snow-covered landscape. He stood there until they were just specks on the horizon, then gone. He was alone again on the Mourning Dove Ranch. But the silence was different now. It was not the crushing silence of grief, but the quiet peace of solitude. he was still a widower. He was still a rancher. But he was no longer a ghost. The story of the siege at the McGregor Ranch became a legend in that part of Arizona. Deputy Miller, half mad with fear, told a rambling, terrified story that put the fear of God into the town of redemption. No one ever bothered Caleb McGregor again. He rebuilt his house smaller and simpler this time. He did not carve Martha's initials into the new mantelpiece. He placed the Apache knife there instead. He lived for another 30 years, a man respected and slightly feared a man who seemed to carry a deep wisdom in his stormy blue eyes. He never saw Chiricahua or Nantan again, but sometimes on a quiet evening he would look towards the Dragoon Mountains, and he would know that he was not truly alone. He had found his humanity again in the most unlikely of alliances, learning that a man's heart, however broken, can be reforged, and that sometimes shelter is something you give not just to others, but to yourself. The legend of Caleb McGregor and the 9 Chiricahua warriors is a stark reminder that the heroes and villains of the Old West weren't always so clearly defined. It's a story of how unimaginable loss can forge a prison of hatred, but also how a single act of courage and humanity can provide the key to break free. In the face of a raging storm, both outside and within, a widowed rancher and a hunted chief found common ground, proving that brotherhood isn't about the color of your skin, but about the content of your character when the bullets start to fly. Their story, etched in fire and snow, tells us that even in the most desolate of landscapes, the seeds of a new future can be planted in the ashes of the past. If this story from the forgotten corners of history moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a true tale of the West, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten legends and unlikely heroes. Thanks for listening.